Well, welcome everybody. I'm Gigi Rosenberg and I'm a public speaking coach, and I am so delighted to be here today with Dr. Amy Climer. I met Amy in the depths of the pandemic when somehow I got invited to one of her online workshops. And I remember she took us around her studio to show us her fancy audio and her lighting, and she looked so amazing, especially all of us were sitting in the dark on Zoom. And I learned so much then, and I thought, when I have a podcast someday, I'm going to invite Amy to be on my podcast. So this has been years in the making, this invitation. So I wanted to first introduce her, and then we're going to dig into so many of the things she does. So Amy Climer has helped thousands become more creative. Her clients have included the Mayo Clinic, Stanford University, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. She's a TEDx speaker, host of the Deliberate Creator podcast, and the creator of one of my favorite tools to use, which is the Climer Cards. So I want to start our talk today talking about the Climer Cards. But first, welcome, Amy, to the show.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. I had completely forgotten about giving everyone a tour of my studio. So thank you for bringing back that memory. That's super fun.
It was a great tour, and I learned a ton.
That's awesome.
So Climer Cards, there are actually two. There's, I guess, 1.0 and then Climer Cards 2.0. And I use them in training, but I first want to have Amy, I'd love to know why you decided you needed them and how you, just maybe a couple of ways that you suggest people use them with teams.
Yeah, absolutely. So Climer Cards, this is the new box, Gigi. I always can tell like how long someone has had the deck based on the box, so that you have the plastic box. So those are pretty old. And actually we graduated, I guess, or moved on to a paper box because I kept shipping them to Australia, where I have a vendor out there, and the boxes were cracking. They were breaking. And so anyway, we went to the paper box, which is a little nicer anyway. Okay, well, let me just first say what Climer Cards are, and then I can share a bit of that inspiration you asked about. So they look just like a deck of playing cards, that same size and shape. And then on one side, there are all these little paintings that I did. These were watercolor paintings, and the purpose of these is to deepen conversations with other people, mostly used by facilitators, trainers, coaches, teachers. And the way they work is you lay them all down on the table. There's 50 or 52 cards. And then you ask a question, and you say, since the listeners are mostly speakers, you might say, pick a card that represents something you struggle with when you're on stage. And then people pick a card that's, a metaphor. Maybe they pick this like thundercloud with a lightning bolt, and that sparks something that they, want to share about something they struggle on stage. So that's a little bit of what they are. And I was inspired to make them. It's been a long time. I released them in 2012. So they've been going strong for 12 years. And I had made a deck, something like this, just for myself, for my own use. And there are other similar products out there like Climer Cards, but at the time, they were basically like bad 1990s clip art. And so the images were not that inspiring, or just didn't always fit with the groups I was working with. So I drew my own. And I had no intention of using these beyond my own little groups. But one day I was with doing a team building program, and a client was a friend of mine. Her name's Sarah. And we do this activity. The group they just did a really poor job. Like, there was a lot of fighting and arguing. And so after the activity, I laid the cards down on the table or on the ground. We were outside. And I said, pick a card that represents your own behavior in this activity. And it sparked amazing conversation. One person started, she teared up, she started crying, and she said, this is not how I want to be. The way I was just now is not who I want to be. And it was just this amazing conversation that the group really got closer together. And then, of course, the next activity, they rocked it. So Sarah was talking to me, and she said, Amy, these cards are really cool. Have you ever thought about doing something with them? And I was like, what? No. And, sometimes it takes somebody else to see what we can't see within ourselves, And that was, Sarah's comment was brilliant. And I started researching, well, how do I get these manufactured? And how can I make these? And I ended up launching them on a Kickstarter campaign, which was a really cool experience. It helped me test whether or not anybody actually wanted these. And then I launched them. I got them manufactured in 2012. And then I really thought I was just going to make a few hundred decks and this would be a nice little project. And here we are 12 years later. They've been used in 57 countries. Just the stories I hear are amazing. And I know you have some stories around them, Gigi, but that's a little nutshell of how they were created.
That's great. I happen to love cards. I mean, I have several cards on all kinds of subjects. So the form of them really appealed to me. But it must have been in a training you gave, or maybe that day when you were touring the office and you mentioned the Climer cards, you said that one way to use them, and this is how I use them. I first started using it with my husband, actually. I thought I'm going to test it with him. So we were getting ready to have a little family meeting. Like, who's supposed to take care of what house project? He hates these meetings. Like, he avoids them at all costs. And so I'm always chasing him around. Anyway, so I thought, we're going to start the family meeting in a different way today. So I opened the card pack and I said, I'd like you to pick a card that represents how you want to feel at the end of this meeting.
Nice.
And he looked at me blankly and picked a card. Look at, he maybe not really getting it. Now he's got a PhD in physics, but this was hard for him. So I picked this card, which is a person in a canoe. And he looked at it and he goes, oh, so the way you want to feel at the end of this meeting is you want to be alone in a canoe? And I was like, oh, no. The way I want to feel at the end of this meeting is I want to feel in the flow. Like we're not stuck anymore with who's doing what. We're in the flow. And he was like, oh, okay. And I can't even remember what card he picked, but it was great to pick the card in the beginning and then check in after. So now when I do public speaking trainings, I'll have the cards laid out on a table. People come in and I'll say, how do you want to feel about your public speaking by the end of this training today? And everybody gets it. I'll tell the story of my husband when I open, just so if someone doesn't get it, they don't feel dumb, Mm-hmm. But it's a wonderful way to also for a trainer to make sure that we check in at the end.
Yeah.
Did this land? Oh, what landed? Et cetera. So I just love them. And I do have two.
I love it. Yeah. Deck 2 was the deck that people had been asking me, oh, when are you going to create a second deck? And finally in 2023, I was able to get that out in the world. And it's more of like an additional deck, a companion deck. So there's another 50 images.
That's great. Good. Now, the other thing is there is a digital version of the deck. And so, it's funny. I have used them in online trainings and I just hold the images up and I say, which one do you want? It doesn't work quite as well as if you're doing an in-person training. But the digital one, I've never used it before, but people can put the images up on the screen. That's so cool. That's great.
I would highly recommend it. In fact, I do once a month. I do a free workshop that you would probably really appreciate.
I would love that. Yeah.
You'll find that it's much more eloquent than holding up the images.
Oh no, I'm sure. Yeah. I've only done it once, Amy. I promise.
It is. What's cool about the online version is then people they click on the image they want, they write their name, and then they write a description of why they chose that image, and then you can see everybody else's responses.
Oh my God!
And then you can create reports from them if you want, and there's a lot more you can do.
Yeah.
And really, we've all seen really bad Zoom sessions or, virtual sessions, and we've all been in really good ones. And this is just a tool to help, trainers and coaches and facilitators make those sessions more engaging, more interactive. It's exciting just to hear all the positive feedback that I've gotten about using them. So and it's very reasonably priced. $12 a
That's
month.
great. I mean, everybody is always asking me, how can I make my Zoom meetings more engaging? And this is such a surefire way. Also, it's like having music playing or flowers on the table. It's such like, oh, wow, what is that? And what are we going to do with that? And suddenly people are engaged, you know. So I just love them.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about your new book. It's coming out in 2025. It's called Deliberate Creative Teams: How to Lead for Innovative Results. I would love to hear, if you have it ready, your elevator speech for the book and what you're thinking, like your perfect audience member.
Yeah. So the book is for leaders who want their teams to be more innovative or more creative, but they don't quite know where to start. Or maybe they've made some attempts and they've gotten stuck. And the book teaches the system of creativity in teams, that there's actually, and I think for some people it sounds a little like, wait, what? There's a system? I thought creativity was all about a free-for-all. Not really. And so it does teach this deliberate process that if you follow it, your teams will be more creative. And there's all this research that backs that up. It's not just my opinion. And I'm really excited about the book. I do care deeply about research and feel like that there are many books out there on creativity that are more from an individual's experience and their perspective, which is great. But I really try to bring in the research that this works and here's why. And so I'm really excited about it.
That's great. And the book is full of so many examples of when creativity wasn't applied in a full way, and when it was, and what the outcomes were. So yeah, all that research is really great. So I was really fascinated with chapter 2, which is called Not by Magic or Chance. And you take the reader through a spectrum in there that I would love you to describe to us, that creativity spectrum, and then how somebody might apply that if they were working by themselves, or how that spectrum applies to just the individual trying to figure out, what do I want to say in this speech I'm about to give?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So you can think of this spectrum almost like rungs on a ladder. So there's 5 levels, and I'll start at the bottom, which is the least creative level, which is called the destructive level, which is where, now this was written for teams, but yeah, you could apply it to an individual. And I often say teams are made of individuals, so the individual person does make a big difference. Okay, so at the destructive level, you have teams who are doing what they can, whether intentionally or not, to sabotage creativity. So an idea is brought up and people are like, oh, no, we can't do that. We did that in 1985 and it was a complete disaster, right? We've all been there. Now, a team can have an occasional moment of, the destructiveness. It doesn't mean they're always in that state. But more or less what happens is that the team, they just put roadblock up after roadblock and they're not being creative together. And the impact of that, and each of these levels has an impact, is that they can actually, have a negative impact on the financial or whatever your bottom line is, whether it's, financial, whether it's about, the environmental impact, whatever you're trying to do, they will have a negative impact on that. So we go from destructive. The next level is stagnant. This is the team that I think of as like, they're at 0, they're neutral, they're not really causing harm per se, but they're not like decreasing your income, but they're also not contributing it to it either. So you could say by not contributing, they're causing harm. It depends on your situation. But the point here is that they're stagnant. So they're doing things the way they've always been done. They're not interested in looking at new approaches. Now, I'll also say, just as a side note, not every team needs to be creative. So some teams, it is completely appropriate for them to stay in this stagnant space and keep doing things as they've always been done. So I just wanted to put that little side note that sometimes this is okay. But assuming we're trying to be creative and innovative, so we go from destructive to stagnant, and then the next level is where we start seeing some positive creative impact, and that's the sporadic level. Now, I say sporadic because this is the team where sometimes they see results, innovative results. And they're like, yes, that was awesome. That was amazing. But they don't quite know how they got there. And so it's sort of just like this fun accident. Like, I don't know, we figured this out. It was really cool. That's good. But what's even better is level 4 and 5. And level 4 is the sustainable level. So this is the team. They're highly creative, but they know how it works. They understand the creative process, which I explain in the book, and they use it. And everybody on the team can, they're flexible. They know how to use it. So that's a sustainable level. Now, sorry, backing up a second, the sporadic level, the way I've measured impact in the book is just, so we got 0, stagnant is 0, up 1 is sporadic. I call that 1x. So let's say your organization, like a creative idea, a solution is a $50,000 impact. So that would be the sporadic team is adding to the bottom line of $50,000 a year. The sustainable team is 3x. So they're adding to the bottom line $150,000 a year. And then the very top level is the scalable team. And the scalable team is the one, like, they know how creativity works. They're able to tap into it, but they're doing it in a way that is either scalable beyond just their team, or they're teaching other teams within the organization how to be at that level. And that's a 5x level. So now we're looking at $250,000 impact. The X here, insert the number that works for your organization, right? In some cases that might be 1,000, in some cases that might be 1,000,000. But the point here is that the better you understand the creative process and the tools you need to be a deliberate creative team, the higher you go into that, on that spectrum. And I think it works for the individual as well. I mean, I certainly see it in my own life. I have a consulting practice where it's just me and an assistant. I don't necessarily have a big team, but I see this too. And there have been moments where I've been stagnant and then other moments where I'm more sporadic or sustainable, so it definitely can fluctuate over time. And ideally it's a positive growth, like I am have a more sustainable level of creativity than I did 10, 15 years ago, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm sure you can also catch yourself too thinking, wow, I keep coming up with ideas and then I keep shooting them down,
Right. Usually the shooting them down is like, this is a great idea. I don't have time to implement it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I clone myself a few times.
Well, there's so much great wisdom in the book. And there's a line a little bit later in the book about, and I think the line was something like, we are a crew, not passengers.
Yes.
And I love that because it made me think of when I teach public speaking. One of the things I teach is you don't want the audience sitting there passively. So in a way, you could also apply that to all the people sitting there. If they're just passengers and you're taking them on this ride, they can just be really sitting back the whole time and not really engaged. So one of the things I teach is don't spoon feed the audience. And I've seen you do this on the stage too. So get them to answer questions, get them to solve a problem, get them to think about it before you just say, this is the question and here's the answer.
Yeah.
Even if you leave a space between there, people will start thinking. So I love that idea of a crew and not passengers. And definitely with a team, if it's a crew, everybody has something to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that phrase "we are crew, not passengers" comes from Outward Bound, which is an organization that I've worked with on and off for a couple, maybe 12, 15 years. But I was also a student back when I was 16 years old. I went on an Outward Bound course, and Outward Bound is this really cool program where they take people out backpacking, rock climbing, canoeing, some sort of wilderness experience. And it is not a catered tourist experience. It's like, okay, we need to get to this destination. If we don't make it, we're hiking till midnight. That's fine. And we'll make dinner whether, we get there or along the way, but this is the crew making the dinner, not the leaders. It's not like a plush rafting trip yeah. And so that's where that idea of crew, not passengers comes, that it's so I do think sometimes people, and I see this in teams a lot, where people get frustrated. They're like, well, I don't know, somebody should do that. Well, why not you?
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
And to your point with the speaking, I'm always thinking about, especially it's hard. I do think it's hardest in those shorter, 45 minutes to an hour speech where I really want a full day with the group, but that's all I have is the hour. How can I get them applying what I'm teaching them right there in the moment? That's what I really like to think about. Yeah, whether it's just thinking about a concept, or can we actually do it? And I have done that in with 250 people in the room. Like, hey, let's get started. Let's go.
Wow. So if you've got an hour, are you giving them assignments right there that
Mhm.
they're doing at their in their seat?
Yeah, it's a little like this one that I'm thinking of that I did back in April. It worked really well. Now it was 2 hours that I had, so just that little bit of extra time helped. And it's more of like an experiential keynote, but it was a group of engineers from a manufacturing company, a global manufacturing company, and we were walking through the concepts in the book, deliberate creative teams and creative problem solving. And they each wrote down a challenge that they were working on, and then I led them through this process where they were sharing ideas with each other to how to solve that problem. And they loved it. They walked away with, most people walked away with a dozen new ideas, but at the least, a few, right, that they hadn't thought about.
That's
And
great.
more importantly, they're learning the process that then they can go back to their plant and put it in practice there.
Yeah. So when they were sharing with each other, you had them break up into groups of just groups, or two people would share with each other. Is that what you did?
I think I had it in trios.
Yeah, trios. That's great. It's so funny. Sometimes presenters feel that everything needs to go through them, like they need to be involved in everything. And it's so interesting as a participant, if I just share with my partner or my two partners, that's me verbalizing and talking, and that may be just as valuable as the teacher coming over and working with you. Do you know what I mean? And I think sometimes presenters forget that, how
Yeah,
important it is to let time for people to talk to each other, even if you as the presenter aren't involved in that.
absolutely. And I do think that as a presenter, it requires us to kind of let go of our ego a little bit, and to recognize that it doesn't have to be all about us, right? Like, in fact, one of the biggest challenges I have is in this context, I really have no idea how it's going. And that I can see them, I can see they're interacting. I might be able to listen in to like one or two groups, but I have no idea what kind of experience they're actually having. And we're certainly not going to do report outs or something. I mean, with a couple hundred people in the room, that sounds horrible, right? But I do invite a couple of people to share. Like, did anybody have a creative idea that they hadn't thought of before? And that can be a little bit of a litmus test to see, what gets shared. And then I have to rely a lot on the feedback afterwards.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. The thing of it's not about you leads me to my next thing I wanted to point out in the book. You tell some amazing stories about the Mayo Clinic in different ways. And the one about how the Mayo Clinic and your personal story with it is amazing. I'm going to let people read that in the book. The one I'm thinking about now is when you were on your way to present, to do a training at the Mayo Clinic, and you were feeling a little bit nervous.
Yeah.
And tell that story, and then what the learning was that you had that really relates to it's not about me.
Yeah. Yeah. That was such a big moment. So, okay. So the Mayo Clinic invited me to come teach a group of their leaders about deliberate creativity. And I was so honored that the Mayo Clinic is considered the best hospital in the world, and that and they're incredibly innovative already. So I was just, so honored. And I had spent all this time putting together the program, and I'm on the plane on the way, and I have a layover in Atlanta because I live in a small town. I always have to go through Atlanta. And I'm in the gate area for the flight from Atlanta to Rochester, Minnesota, where the Mayo Clinic is. And Rochester is a small town, so it's a small airplane. And I realize as we're boarding that I really need to use the bathroom, but there's not time to run to the bathroom and then back. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to use the bathroom on the plane. I'm going to be that person. So I get on, and of course, as luck would have it, my seat is in the first row, and the bathroom's all the way in the back. So I put down my backpack and I walk to the back. And first, as I'm going to the back, I'm like right behind, the people that like board early that need a little extra time. And there's an older couple that are blocking the aisle, and they're sort of bent over their seat, and I can't really tell what they're doing. And I'm standing there for what feels like quite a while. And I finally just said, can I help you with anything? And they turned around towards me, and the woman said to me, "Oh, sorry, we'll just be a minute." And then she like barked some order at her husband. That's how I knew they were married. And then, but when she turns around, I see the oxygen mask, the oxygen line in her nose that's going down into the tank that's in their seat. And they're trying to untangle this clear oxygen tube. And I just tried to pull out all the empathy I could. And I just put my hand on her shoulder and said, "No worries, take your time." So they wrap up, they finish. I go all the way to the back, use the bathroom. I come out. The plane is now full, and all these people are standing in the aisle, and I'm not going anywhere. So I'm just standing there waiting, and I'm watching as people are getting settled, and I see more medical devices on one flight than I have ever seen in my life. I mean, there must have been 20 different, oxygen tanks, and I don't even know what. And I get back to my seat, and I'm thinking about all these people on the flight. And all of a sudden, I just get this calmness that sort of comes over me. And I realize that me going to the Mayo Clinic and working with these leaders, it's not about me. It's not about me doing a good job for them. This is about me being in a place of service so that they can then serve all the people that are on this flight, and the million patients they serve every year. And I just got chills, and I felt so much calmer, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to go and give everything I have. And I even am getting chills telling the story.
Me too. Me too. That's such an incredible story, and you told it so beautifully. It's just, it's funny. I think with anything you do, whether it's a toast or whether it's a financial report, it's so not about you. You are in service of something so much bigger. You want people to have a certain experience, and you're at that moment the conduit for that experience. And it's so not about you. That's just such a great, what a great story that helped you get to that place. Because that's often where I want speakers to get to when it's not such a dramatic story,
And I think about that a lot when I'm on stage. And I've had a journey to learn how to be a better speaker, and I still have, more to learn. But I used to be super shy. And for me, like being on stage, I would, I certainly wasn't like being demonstrative with my arms or, essentially taking up space. And I've learned that while that may not be always comfortable for me to do, that I might feel a little silly, it's actually in service to the audience for me to, give them everything, even if it's like not, maybe at times it feels awkward. But if that's what's best for them, then that's what I should do.
Well, that's a great segue to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is when I see you on stage, what I see and experience is just a ton of like infectious, contagious energy, a friendliness, a warmth. I'm happy to be here. This is going to be fun. I feel like I'm in good hands. So, not everyone's born that way. I thought maybe you're just born that way.
Oh,
So
no.
how did you learn to show up in that way? I mean, I'm sure it was a process, but I'm just curious about what some of the, points of that process were that help you show up in such a awake, alive place.
Mm-hmm. I think it's been a combination of things. One is watching other people and seeing what they do and then pulling what I think would work for me, but in doing it my own way. I think, there's like this fine line of like copying someone and just learning from them, right? And I do learn well from watching other people. I think that just fits my learning style. And then the other piece is learning, hearing like, well, what works well. So for instance, one of the things I've learned is that when people can see your hands, they tend to trust you more, right? And this is, who knows, just ingrained in our DNA in some way, because, perhaps if people can't see your hands, you're like, well, what are you hiding, right? Well, in this online space, the video is only showing like this very small segment. And so one of the things I heard from somewhere along the way is like, show your hands. And I naturally talk with my hands anyway, so that wasn't difficult. But when I'm just talking to somebody, at a coffee shop, my hands aren't in this view that the video camera would pick up. And so then I'm like, oh, well, if I'm using my hands and I just bring them in, that is in service to the people I'm talking to, because they'll be able to see my hands and trust me more. And that's a positive thing, right? So it's still, in alignment with who I am. I'm still being myself, but I'm just making this slight adjustment. And those are the kind of things that I try to think about. Like, what you're seeing is me, right? And, if we were to meet in person at a coffee shop, you'd still see me, right? Now, one of the things I'm doing, and I am conscientious to do in this virtual space, is I do dial it up a little bit, because let's assume 50% of the energy gets lost into the internet. And so what you're reading is 50% less than what I might be putting out. And so that's just, again, like something that I'm thinking about as a speaker and a presenter. And again, it's all about what's best for the listener and what can I do to serve them well.
That's great. So I'm sure that the answer to this is yes, but do you still get nervous before you're going to get on stage?
Yeah, definitely.
What do you do about that? I mean, what are your, I'd love to hear some of the things in your bag of tricks for helping yourself.
I think a few things. One is I always show up early. I am not going to show up 15 minutes before I go on stage, because that's going to make me more stressed. So I'm going to always be there at least an hour early, sometimes an hour and a half. And there have been many times where I needed every minute of that because there was a mic issue, or, I'm about to talk to, 500 people. They've got a podium smack in the middle of the stage, and I don't talk behind a podium, so it allows time for all of these little adjustments that are going to make me feel better, but also, better serve the audience. And then the other thing I often do, more so if it's a smaller group, maybe, under 200, if there's time, and actually, maybe I even do this with bigger groups. If I have the time, I just go talk to some people, maybe some people sitting more towards the front, and I'll go introduce myself, and then I'm the speaker, and I ask, what's their name, and it helps me feel like, oh, I'm just talking to some friends, or I'm talking to some people that I know. And that's really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. But what about that last 5 minutes when you're standing behind the curtain and they're starting to announce you, and that, any second you're going to be out there. What are you doing? I always want to know to me, that's the most excruciating. Those are the most excruciating moments, that 5 minutes till go time. Anything else you do during those, or that you fall back on during those times?
I have definitely just become a big believer in deep breaths. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I remember hearing that when we breathe in deeply, that oxygen goes to our brain and actually decreases our temperature of our brain. I mean, I'm sure by, some minuscule amount, but still, I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So it helps me, that can help. There's all this scientific research that can help us think more clearly. And, I think so that can be helpful. And I try to really just think about the audience.
Yeah. I mean, I totally see that when you walk on the stage, like you're there like, oh, who are you? Not like, oh God, I'm here in front of all. Yeah. Yeah. I totally see that.
And then the other thing I will say I do is that if I'm nervous, it is not helpful for the audience for me to tell them that.
Oh my God. No way. Yeah, yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
That is my
Yeah.
problem. And I'm just going to focus on like just giving them the content or whatever I'm doing. But
Yeah, yeah. Focus on what you're there to serve up. Yeah. It's
Mhm.
funny. I've only seen admitting you're nervous work a couple of times when people have done it. It's one of those weird things that, depending on the people, the person, the context, etc., sometimes it helps, but I don't, it's not a go to that I recommend. Yeah, yeah. I totally agree.
Once in a while, I've seen someone say it. I'm like, okay, that was funny. They nailed it.
Yeah,
That was not the most common. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely. That's great. So I'm just going to look at my list here and see what else. Oh, have you ever had to deal with any mishaps on stage while you were, not during the tech rehearsal, but while you were there, and then something really goofed up? Because that can also make you very, very nervous. And any mishaps that have happened that you had a great way of fixing?
Oh, that's a good question. Especially the great way of fixing. That's hard. And I've definitely had people, I think this is always the scariest part for a speaker is when you give the audience member the microphone, right?
Oh
And
my God, yes. I was going to ask you about the Q&A. So yes, that let's talk about that, because I think sometimes people are so afraid to give up control, which is what you're doing. I mean, actually a tip I teach is that if you are going to do a Q&A and have somebody walk around with the mic, don't give the speaker the mic. Just have somebody hold it at their mouth. First of all, it'll get the mic in the right position, but also it it helps the person not get away with it. But so tell me how you deal with that struggle between I need to maintain control and I want to hear from people.
yeah. Well, I will say I don't always get it right. I actually had a kind of, I bombed this maybe, gosh, only 3 weeks ago. And unfortunately it was during the Q&A, so it's a little bit easier if it's earlier on. Like I do this activity is not the right word, but just a question to the audience really early on. And I put up the definition of creativity and I ask them to, what do you make of this, basically? And I give them a chance to talk in pairs, and then I invite a few people to comment. And that's interesting because sometimes people don't answer the question, right? Like I've asked them to talk about this definition of creativity, and instead they give me different definitions of creativity. Whatever, we're just going with it here, right? Like, so I don't get too caught up in it. Or they want to tell a story. And so sometimes I'll, maybe if I think of it, I'll preempt that, like, don't necessarily need to hear all the things you talked about, but just, and I try to be really prescriptive, like and I repeat the directions multiple times without feeling too repetitive. That can be really helpful. But I will tell you the thing that I bombed recently that I did not even recover well from. So 750 people at a conference of educators, so people that work for charter schools. And I finished the talk and there was like a little time for questions. And the reality is I shouldn't have done a Q&A. That's the learning, is there wasn't enough time for a proper Q&A, but I do love Q&As. I think they could be really cool. It might have just been too big of a group and too little time. But anyway, so I do this Q&A and I asked, what questions do you have about deliberate creativity and what we talked about? And this guy in the very, very back of the room, like against the wall, is like, bouncing, raising his hand, right? So there's a mic runner. They go to him, and he just launches into this like long soliloquy. Gigi, I don't even know what he was talking about. I mean, it was
God.
not helpful for anyone. It was just pumping him up in a way that was actually making him look like an idiot. And I just was confused. I was like, okay, I don't know. There's no question here at all. I mean, it wasn't. And at that point, I mean, he went on and on for 2 minutes, maybe a minute and a half. It was a long time. And so then, and I could see people were getting fidgety. And
Oh
so
my
as soon
God.
as I could, I got like the mic back. I really had my own mic, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I just did a quick wrap up, a close, and said, thank you, everyone. And I was doing a breakout session, so tried to direct more questions to that breakout session. But yeah, that was a mistake that I made, and that I probably shouldn't have done Q&A unless I'd had more.
Yeah. But, I think you did the best you could given the situation. And it's so funny when in those kind of situations, I always tell people, you're the king or queen of the room at that moment. Nobody else can make that, shut that person up except you. And that was really the best you could have done. I've been in similar situations when, you just need to dive in and get the control back. And it sounds like that was really all you could have done.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
I want to ask you another. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
no, I was just going to say I tried to do the like, oh, okay, thank you, and it didn't help.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But the audience all knew what you were up to, in a good way. Like, thank you, Amy. So I want to talk to you a little bit about audience engagement, because one thing that I notice when I'm an audience member is I don't like it when the speaker is asking me to do something too early before I've gotten to know them a little bit. Like if a speaker just walks in and says, okay, everyone stand up. And I'm like, whoa. I need to know, what are we going to do? Why are we standing up? And it might only have taken me a few minutes to think, oh, I'm in good hands, but I need to know I'm in good hands before I'll feel and I notice that vibe in audiences as well. So what got me thinking about that is that the other day I had somebody ask me what I thought my own personal opinion was when a speaker comes out and says, "Good morning, Austin, Texas." And then they want everyone to yell back because they wanted to know, should I do that? And I said, I don't like that. And it's just, I just feel like a circus seal or something, and I don't like it at all. But it also has to do with the fact that when I'm in the audience, I want to get to know you a little bit before I'm willing to then, like, I think a speaker needs to be there first. And then the audience will come and meet them, not wait for the audience to. So I was just curious about your thoughts about when you decide to ask the audience for something.
I love that point about that you want to get to know the speaker a little bit, because you want to get to know the speaker because that builds up some trust. And I think that's a really good thing to think about. I do not come out and say, everybody stand up right away. Now I do it fairly early, not stand up, but I do give them some directions fairly early. But I also think about this idea of risk, and that I always am starting out with really low risk activities. So I'm going to ask the group to turn and talk to your neighbor and talk about this thing that's up on the screen. Like really low risk. They really could turn and talk to someone and just not even talk, or talk about something completely different, right? Like they could do whatever they wanted. Nobody's monitoring that. And they can go as deep or as light as they wanted. So that, I think, is that early on, you want to give them activities that are, or things to do that are really low risk. I'm like you. I do not like it when speakers ask the audience for like a call and response that has no point, right? Like I might say, "Hey, good morning, Austin," but I'm not expecting them to yell it back at me. Now, maybe there's an exception because there's been you're the third speaker and this is like part of the culture of the event. That's different. But if it's just, more of an isolated keynote, then no, I wouldn't do that. And I find it really insulting when they're like, "Oh, I couldn't hear you. Let's try that again."
Oh, God. Yeah.
Are we like leading camp or something?
Yeah.
And I also don't find it valuable. Well, this is also the other thing. I'm going back to like, what's the best for the audience, right? And then a lot of times, when speakers will say, "What do you think about this?" Like, yes or yes. And it's like, that's not about me yelling yes to you isn't helping me.
Right.
That's just providing this like environment that maybe makes the speaker feel good. I don't know.
Right.
I feel like somebody somewhere came up with this idea in the 80s, and
I
then all
know.
think it's a good idea.
I
They're like,
know. And it will not die.
we have evolved, people. Yeah.
It's such a great question to ask what does this audience need? Just the other day, I was at a ceremony. It was a lighting of these 3 giant sequoia trees that were saved in my neighborhood. It was an incredible saving of these 3 trees that are saved, in perpetuity. And the speaker was giving a little story about how they were saved. And the crowd was very, very, it's such an emotional story. And everybody was from the neighborhood, and the trees were standing right under the trees. And it was so amazing. And one of the things I noticed was he didn't give us time to applaud and cheer at certain moments. He talked wall to wall, and everybody was like, and so at the end, we just all went crazy, but it was like building. And I thought that was a situation where if he read the audience well, he would have realized that there were certain moments when he could have just said, "Welcome to the lighting of the sequoia trees." And we were all ready to go, yay, So it's so interesting being able to read, what does this audience need? We were an audience that needed to cheer very, very soon, because we knew him, we knew the neighborhood. This was our 8th year of doing this, etc. So it all depends on what that audience needs.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And I do think that, part of the evolution of being a good speaker is, of course, learning to read the audience. And not only learning to read it, but being comfortable reading it and being willing to read it. Because I think if we're too caught up in, I have to deliver this in a certain amount of time, then you're missing out on, the reactions from the room. And sometimes, like, I'm not a comedian, or I'm not like a humorist. But I've had some of the most funny moments of being able to respond to someone in the audience. And sometimes it just leads to this really cool stuff that if I had ignored what was happening, like I had this moment, if I could just share one story.
Yeah.
So 2 years ago, I was emceeing a conference, this conference that I had emceed it before. It was my 2nd year doing it. And I had been involved in this organization for many years. It's called the Association for Experiential Education. Super cool group. And so last year in 2023, I was, something happened. And this person in the audience, they had a rubber chicken like this. And they squeaked the chicken. And it was like so funny in the moment, because they were like, I said something and it was like their response. Now, this is an audience where at least half the audience owned a rubber chicken. So this was like, a normal thing. And so anyway, so I call this guy out and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so funny. And then the next year I came back in 2024, and we had planned this in advance that everybody got a little rubber chicken when they walked into the room. And then we were like, let's build on last year. We're going to get really intentional. Just squeak the chicken when something resonates with you. It's sort of like the snaps, right? And it was really fun, and it worked really well. I would have missed it if I hadn't been able to just be present and be there at the audience.
Right. Yeah.
So
but how do you read an audience? Like if you're standing there thinking, I wonder how this is landing, or I wonder, what are you looking at? What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are you doing to get the vibe of the audience? Do you know?
Yeah, that is hard. That's a hard question, because I try to find a few people in the audience that I feel like, you're just sort of taking a guess, but you feel like, okay, maybe these people will be able to give you some feedback as we go. Like there's usually someone who is a nodder, right?
Yes. I love the nodders. Love the nodders.
Right? Or
Yes.
the smilers, right? You have to be careful, because sometimes, like my wife is like this. She's got a really flat affect. And so many times in her life, people have come up to her after a program or something and said, are you okay? Like, was that bad? And she was like, what? No, that was great. What are you talking about? She was fully paying attention, but she just didn't have like a big smile on her face, So you do have to watch for that. Yeah, and it's hard. I do
Yeah.
think it's hard. Like I've had some groups where I felt this really great connection with, and then other groups where it was a little hard to read and I couldn't really tell how things were going.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. It is, and you can't always you can't always trust the stories you're coming up in your own mind in the moment. You have to go, well, that's what my hunch is, but I really don't know what's happening. Because
Yeah.
if it's a quiet group, you may find out later they were just really with you, listening, and they just aren't a group that expresses a lot. So it's so true.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, I know this isn't a great answer for listeners, but I do think there's some just intuition involved.
Yeah, yeah, a gut check is always a good thing. Yeah. Well, I have one more question for you about creativity.
Okay.
So my question is, I grew up in a family of artists. I've a super DIY family. If I want a new outfit for school, I literally had to sew one myself, etc. So very creative. But I still to this day will dread or procrastinate before not a sewing project or a crafty project. I don't procrastinate about those. I don't know why. But sitting down sometimes to do some writing
Mm.
or whatever. Once I've started, I'm so happy.
Mm.
It's like I'm in the kitchen making my thing. But the struggle before is, so I've developed all these tricks and this and that to do for myself that work. But I just wonder, why do you know why humans do that? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, my guess. I don't know. Certainly, this isn't scientific, but my guess is well, a couple things. One, I think, is we've all got that inner critic, and I I don't know why we need the inner critic. I'm sure it's to prevent us from doing really stupid things, but we all have the inner critic that's telling us, yeah, that blog post you have, that's going to be stupid. Yeah, don't write that. And so sitting down, you have to fight that inner critic. And then once you get going, the inner critic is silenced and you're in the flow and all as well. But I do think that's something we all grapple with as humans. I also think, okay, so there's this process. So in the book, I talk about the creative process, and there's 4 stages to the creative problem solving process. And each of us have a preference for one or more of those stages. So just really quick, those stages are clarify, ideate, develop, implement. So we've all used this process, whether we were aware of it or not. It's based on how we naturally solve problems. And here, just for those of you watching visually, I'll put up the image. The problem is each of us has a preference for one or more of these stages. Like and there's an assessment tool you can take to measure this. So I am a high implementer, or sorry, a high ideator and a high implementer, but I'm lower as a developer. And what I've figured out is that writing specifically is probably more of a develop type task. So I got plenty of ideas of what I want to put in my book, but to really build those ideas out is more of a develop type process. Like I dreaded writing an outline. I mean, I wrote the book and then I went back and made the outline and then added more to the book. The outline was so painful for me because it's a develop type process or technique, whatever you want to call it. So I found that once I could get going, then I was able to do it just fine. And it actually kind of started moving more into like an implement type of a task. But what I found is that when I understand this about myself, I can then identify why I'm procrastinating, why I'm avoiding this task. And then that helps me not avoid it.
That is so great. I think I'm like you. The development is hard.
Mm-hmm.
I love to ideate. Ideas just a dime a dozen. And then I love to implement.
Yeah. I think you're right.
Yeah.
We're the same.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Well, that is a great place to wrap up. Thank you so much, Amy. But before we say goodbye, tell everybody how they can find you.
Sure. So if you're interested in the book, you can go to deliberateCreativeTeams.com, and that'll take you to learn more about the book. My website for my consulting practice is climerconsulting.com, and Climer is spelled Climer. There's no B in it. And you can also check out climercards.com.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been Gigi Rosenberg in conversation with Dr. Amy Climer. I'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.